Hey guys, it's me Lilly, and today I want to do another episode on wilderness survival. And today we are going to talk again about shelter, because shelter is so important. So in the last video that I made about shelter, I rewatched this video and then I thought it's too much talking, too much blah blah blah, but not enough of visual pictures. So today I thought I'm going to do again an episode on shelters, but this time I'm going to have some drawings for you. So in a survival situation, shelter is really important. And if you are doing it wrong, it will cost you a lot of calories, time, and maybe your life. Now, in a lot of survival books, like this one here, you will see a lot of great shelters and how to build them. And that's all awesome, okay? So survival books are great, but in most survival books, they don't tell you in which type of situation you should build which shelter. So that's a problem. So today we're going to talk about the types of shelters that you should build in a survival situation, but it all depends on the gear that you have with you. So the gear that you have with you determines the shape of the survival shelter. So if you get stuck in the wilderness as a camper, you already have a tent and sleeping bag, then of course you don't need to build a shelter. Now there's a peculiar case where you might get stuck in the wilderness with a blanket or a sleeping bag or a huge amount of clothes. Now what kind of case is that? Let's say, for example, you are in an airplane and it crashes and you are one of the only survivors. So in that airplane, there's also a lot of suitcases with a lot of clothes. So those clothes you can take as a sleeping bag. Let's say you put on 10 layers of clothes and then it has the same effect as a sleeping bag. It also could be that you find a blanket or that you carry a blanket with you. Or it could be that you are in a canoe camping and then you tip over the canoe because of the torrents and you lose your tent, but you still got your sleeping bag. So this is a special case of survival. Now, in case you have a sleeping bag, a wool blanket or a huge amount of clothes, for whatever reason, then you can attempt building an A-frame shelter. Okay, let's quickly draw an A-frame shelter. So here you can see an A-frame shelter. And it's built like an A-frame, and then we have a rib cage going back, and this is where the person lies, and usually they make the fire in front of the shelter. So here's the problem. This only works either if you have a sleeping bag, wool blanket, or an exceptional amount of clothes, or if the person has a whole lot of weight, muscles and fat, so really like too much weight, in warm conditions. And it's also going to work in summertime, in tropical nights, where the temperature doesn't fall below 25 degrees Celsius. Now usually people make a fire at the entry, and here comes the big problem of the A-frame shelter. So the fire is going to keep the head warm and the body warm, the upper body, but the feet and the legs are too far away from the fire. So here you're going to get cold. And that's a huge problem, especially for women, because when women have cold feet, a lot of them are at risk to get bladder infections and urinary tract infections. But also men can get UTIs. So with this constellation you risk UTIs. And also, if you don't have a bed underneath and no insulation and your hip is getting cold, then you can also get a UTI. So this shelter is not going to work without a sleeping bag. So if you are stuck in the wilderness and you don't have a sleeping bag or a wool blanket or an exceptional amount of clothes, then this is not going to work out. And you will find out in the first night. So people are going to build this. They make a fire in the front. They are fairly warm here at the head and upper body, but their feet are cold and that's a huge problem of the A-frame shelter. Now there's still one solution which might work in summertime. So if you got the time, you could fill up the interior of the A-frame shelter with some leaves, and those leaves, they create a little bit of insulation and they act as a blanket. So that's possible if you find the resources, because you need a whole lot of leaves to fill up this kind of shelter. But also it's just going to work in summertime. It's not going to work when it's cold, like November or March. At least not here in Austria or Germany. This is not going to work. And people in general completely overestimate body heat. Body heat is not that efficient. So it's only working if you got a sleeping bag. You're not going to heat up the air inside of this shelter with your body. It's not that efficient. So that's the A-frame shelter. It's totally fine to build if you have a sleeping bag. Then it's great because your feet are warm, and then you can build the shelter. The big advantage of this shelter is that on 3 or 4 sides you are protected from the elements. You can also build a door here, and then you're completely closed in like in a tent. So that's the big advantage of the A-frame, that it will get you very efficiently out of the elements. Alright, so now I want to show you the better survival shelter in my opinion, especially for the situation if you have nothing on you. And here you can see 2 tripods here and here, and then you just lean a roof towards the ridge line or the ridge pole. And then you make a fire sideways to your body, and now the fire is heating the entire body evenly. So the head, the upper body, and also the legs, they are getting the same amount of heat from the fire. So you're going to be warm from head to toe, and this is really important. Also here you can make a long fire, so you just lay longer logs onto the fire, and you don't have to break down the firewood or so. You don't want to spend a lot of calories on the firewood. So breaking firewood, it's just taking too much time on calories. So it's better to lay the branches just on top of the fire like this, and then you have a really nice long fire. So this is the lean-to shelter. I think that this is the best survival shelter, and it works with or without sleeping bags. So that's the great thing. You can always build this shelter and you will never make a mistake. The only thing that you have to be careful with is the lean-to shelter only protects you from one side. So you have to set this up in the right wind direction. So usually in most survival books you can see that they recommend that you build it sideways to the wind direction. So if the wind comes from here, then this is how you want to set up the lean-to shelter. Now you can also set it up if the wind comes from the back side, but then the warmth of the fire will get dragged away into this direction, meaning that you have to move closer to the fire. And then also there's a case when you want to have the wind direction like this, because this is going to drag the warmth of the fire directly into the shelter. So in case of real cold, like when it's winter time and you're really super cold, you can face the wind side with your shelter. So if the wind comes from this direction, it's going to make your shelter much warmer. But you also have to watch out, because some small parts of the fire can fly onto your body and burn you and burn your clothes. But it really depends on the wood that you are using. There's still a disadvantage if you build the opening facing into the wind. When it's raining or snowing, the rain and snow will come into your shelter. So facing the lean-to shelter towards the wind can be really risky. Okay, now I want to show you the shelter that I would build for 2 people, which is the 2-person lean-to shelter. So you make a lean-to shelter and another lean-to shelter, which is on the opposite direction. And you want to have the fireplace in the middle of the 2 people, so that both of the persons are getting the same amount of heat. Now this is also the constellation that we built on Naked and Afraid. So Sam was sleeping in this shelter, I was sleeping in this shelter, but the wind direction was like this. So the wind direction, although we had really good shelters, the wind was so strong in the night that it dragged the entire heat into his shelter. And I was really cold on this side, especially the stones here. They were really ice cold because of the wind chill. So he was actually sleeping in the warmer shelter because the wind was dragging the flames into his shelter. So actually it was a mistake that I went into this shelter because I was so susceptible to the cold. I should have stayed in this shelter and I should have asked Sam if he wants to switch sides because he was not as susceptible to the cold as me. Alright, so now I want to come back to the lean-to shelter, which I believe is the best survival shelter, emergency shelter for the first 3 days. So for the first 3 days this is definitely fine, but if the survival situation is continuing and you're maybe stuck for 3 weeks, then I would build something else. I would start with a lean-to shelter, but subsequently I would build a huge A-frame shelter. So let's say this was the original lean-to shelter, but then I would make a complete roof over it. Here in the middle there's going to be a fire. So that's the fire here. And then here, this is where the person lies, okay? And then here you can have a second person, or you can have firewood. And if you're alone, I would stuff firewood into the second side of the shelter. And then also if there's a third person, the third person can sleep like this in the shelter. And there's always space for a fourth person. So it really depends on how much persons are in the survival situation. If it's one, you want to build this shelter, and then it also needs to be high enough so that you don't burn down the shelter. And also store the firewood inside of the shelter. The problem is that you're not going to build the shelter in 1 day. You will need like 1 week to build the shelter. It really depends on the resources, but it takes about 1 week to build the shelter. And that's a lot of work, guys. So most of the time you're going to be building in your survival situation. So first you want to start out with the shelter, and this is probably what you can get done in the first day of survival. Because in the first day of survival it really depends on how many hours of daylight you have left. So you might not have more time than building this. And then in the second day I maybe would close in some sides here. And then on the third day I would make some kind of roof up here so that the fireplace is protected. And then I would close in this side as well. So this is how you make the shelter, but it takes a lot of time to build. So this is the best survival shelter for long term. So you're completely out of the elements. You want to close in the sides here as well. Make a door or something. And this is how you are going to survive a long-term survival situation. Alright, so this is pretty much it. So if you're interested in survival, make sure that you go out into the wilderness yourself, or at least take a survival course, because there you learn most of the basics, and the basics are the most important things. If you get the basics wrong, you are more likely to not survive in the wilderness. Okay, so this is it for today. Thank you for watching, guys, and stay tuned till next time.